This is the story of Marvin Morrison, a brilliant man of impeccable character.
You say you're gonna miss me. Well, I'm gonna miss you too. Does it help to know I'll be looking down on you? When I give my accounting of my time down on earth, with joy I'll tell them just what I was worth. Look at my 3 kids, look at my wife, the truest love of my life. Look at my grandkids, all 9 and each one a star. Look at my precious daughters-in-law, these are mine, I love them all. Where your heart is, Jesus said you'd find your treasure, so my worth is beyond measure. Character is what it's all about. And character comes from experiences, but it comes from inside. And so I'm reminded of the story of a man who was very well off and wanted to pass on his all he had to his son. And he says, son, I can give you all that I own. I can deed that all to you, and that's easy to do. But what I am, who I am, you have to get on your own. Well, I had a few good tractors, though the number I can't recall. Had some cattle, a dairy, and a farm or two. But I was just a steward, and I leave that all behind. But my treasures will be mine throughout all time.
The reason for having something like this that hopefully somebody will look at someday and say, I need to know more about this Marvin Morrison. What was a Marvin Morrison? And they will be amazed when they do the research about all the things that he did and said and contributed and made possible.
Look at my friends at ASU, all the 4-H kids I knew. Where your heart is, Jesus said you'd find your treasure, so my worth is beyond measure. Well, life passed by so quickly, there were things yet to do. Not sure why Father called me home, but I trust him, you must too, as heaven opens to my view. Now the greatest gift of God I clearly see. Look at my Savior's smiling face, I can feel his warm embrace. Look at his eyes so full of love and charity. Look at his hands and feet and side. Look how he lived, how he died. Knowing him is this life's greatest treasure, and its worth is beyond measure. And we're all his precious treasures.
The Monday after Thanksgiving, when I was in the 5th grade, Marvin came to school, and we were seated alphabetically, and his name being Morrison and mine being Neely, he sat in front of me. I've been behind him ever since. But it wasn't long before I knew he was something special.
She was the love of his life. I think he wanted to marry her when he was 10 years old and sat behind her in school.
We both received scholarships the same day from the University of Redlands. And so we did. We both went there, yeah.
So then World War II came along, and that interrupted his college career. Dad was some sort of cadet leader in boot camp, finished that, and told all of his guys, now don't do anything stupid when you're home, like get married.
He had only been home a day or two before he asked me to marry him. When we married Gilbert. We married the Neely side, and we married to the Morrison side.
Of course, we loved June, the family, and whoever she married was okay with us.
It was a good combination. Them together, they've supported each other and achieved what they could not have done individually or without each other, I think.
I think Dad felt driven to show the world that Clyde Neely hadn't made a mistake when he gave his daughter's hand to Marvin Morrison.
After marrying and a quick honeymoon to the Grand Canyon, Marvin was soon overseas facing the enemy in the midst of World War II.
I knew he was going to war and he might not come back, you know. Many people didn't. I also knew his character, and I knew that he didn't spare himself many times.
One day on patrol, Marvin and another American soldier stumbled across some German enemy soldiers in a foxhole.
Dad pointed his rifle down in there and ordered them to surrender. And what he told me later was that he was so happy they did because he didn't have any ammunition at that moment.
I do think people grew up faster in those days because of the responsibility that was put upon them.
My father told me enough about his combat experience for me to know how horrible it was. He spoke to me a couple of times about the recurring nightmare of having killed young German boys. And I think that in one case he had to use his bayonet to do it. And I believe that haunted him for the rest of his days.
Marvin was wounded in World War II with shrapnel in his shoulder and later received the Purple Heart.
I had known of people who had gotten telegrams that said slightly wounded before by other people, and they turned out to be severely wounded. So I wasn't really at rest until I heard from him. Of course, he let me know as soon as he could.
He was one of those, the greatest generation, that came back from the war and made the best of everything, and he did that to the very end.
When Marvin and his brother Kenneth returned from the war, their father told them that he was retiring at age 44 and turning over the acreage to his sons. Marvin said he knew what he wanted to do right then.
Well, I was the most surprised person of all. My husband had been to college. I thought he was a violinist. I thought he would be teaching or writing or something like that. And he was going to be a farmer.
We did kid him once. Let's see, how did that come out? He couldn't grow watermelons because his ground was so fertile. The vines grew so fast it would wear the melons out and drag them across the ground. but you know, they had a variety of crops, of course, and did very well. Worked hard at it.
I've known Marvin to get up at 3:30 and whistle as he was getting ready to go to the barn.
You couldn't get out of bed much earlier than they did.
They used to kind of compete with each other to see who could get here first.
I don't know if they were actually racing to get to work very early, but it did seem like a bit of a competition.
I was interviewed for a job at Morrison Brothers Ranch, and the time of the interview and day might be interesting because it was 6 a.m. on Saturday morning.
We would ship steers out weekly, and it was usually 4 in the morning. And of everybody, Marvin was usually the first one there.
Morrison brothers came back from the Army and they just never looked back. And they were super farmers. Everybody looked up to their farming.
He had a wonderful relationship with his brother. How these two men worked together is just like music.
And they each just had their talent. And my dad's was a little bit more behind the scenes, and Uncle Marvin was out in the public.
You could tell by the way they worked together that there's a lot of admiration on both sides.
They were workers, they were workers.
Marvin would always do the hard work first.
Anybody that knew Marvin Morrison knew that though he was a gentleman and was frequently seen in a coat and tie, he was also out on the ditch bank and was working very hard on the farm when he wasn't in a meeting.
If our scale went down, 100,000 pound scale,
that weighed up to there. Marvin would have to go underneath and try to fix the beams or whatever. And there were cesspool, like a swamp down there. There were frogs down there and everything jumping around down there. I wouldn't go down there.
He would say, no man deserves to be the owner or the manager of a farm unless he can do every job on the farm at least as well as the men he employs to do that work.
They were the most honest people I ever dealt with.
One of those people, you shake his hand, his word was his bond.
I knew of their reputation and the quality of feed that they had.
He was committed to being first class all the way in terms of his business practices.
That was one of my first impressions, was the records that they had there. It was outstanding.
Year after year, we would have charts on the back bulletin board of what happened this year, this year, this year. So you could see which fields were really producing over the years, which ones were not. And there were certain reasons, because we had what we called the desert.
I can tell you that the farmers understand the value of water a lot better than the people who are washing down their driveways today.
You don't have water, you don't have much.
In the early to mid-60s, there probably were as many as 20 children at work on the farm at any given time.
I would go with my dad to work, and Uncle Marvin would always be in the office, and he'd sneak us some money to buy soda pops across the street at the shop, and that was one of my favorite childhood memories.
Yes, it's true. We would put 8-year-olds on 40 horsepower tractors and drive around the yard. And then at 10, I had a job. And I have some precious memories associated with that, because that meant that Dad would wake me up at 4:15, and we would come out to the kitchen table and eat a bowl of cornflakes together, and he would deliver me to the tractor at 5 o'clock.
The boys always got to drive a tractor. I never got to drive a tractor, but I got to chop weeds and chop morning glories. And it was a great income. I bought a Swin bicycle.
I probably started driving tractors in the summer when I was about 13, and he's the one who taught me to drive the little Ford tractor. So I got a job, I had some money in my pocket, and I got to be with my dad.
And when we did as much work as the men, he felt, of course, we had earned the same rate of pay. So we made enough money working on the farm to buy our own clothes, and buy our own books in school and things like that, which was another way of teaching us a little bit about financial responsibility at an early age.
Farming is a way of life. It's not just something that you do. It's definitely a way of life. It's a good way to bring up your family, I think. Teaches your kids responsibility, and all of Marvin's boys are as responsible, I think, as their dad.
Dad had passion and perseverance, and he believed that if you worked hard enough, you deserved your success, and that it would come your way. And in his case, it certainly did.
That was pretty much his philosophy, is that, you know, you make it happen. I mean, you work to make it happen. Whatever your dream is, you work to make it happen.
There was a time when Marvin was on 35 boards and commissions simultaneously. This was the same time he had a young family and when Morrison Brothers Ranch was at its largest.
It was a very, very intensive period of hard work and driving service to the industry.
Marvin, when he made an investment of time or commitment, it was a wise investment.
I served on a hospital board.
When I met Marvin, he was on the State Atomic Energy Commission. He was a member of the board of directors of APS.
Marvin was on many boards. Water board for the irrigation districts and things, and he was very active. Like I said, he didn't waste a minute.
That was Dad, always going, always doing stuff. One meeting to the next. So he was very much a doer.
He was always a good spokesman. He was pretty eloquent, could speak well, and so most of the farmers didn't speak that well, so they always liked Marvin to go and talk for everybody, and he was good at it.
People that like to speak
you can't give them enough time when they're speaking, and people that don't like to speak, a minute's too long. So he was one of those people that you only have 10 minutes, can I get another 5?
In his later years, he would ensure some kind of morale boost at the Rotary Club by taking in sheet music, insisting that everyone sing.
Even though you didn't feel like singing at 7 o'clock on a Thursday morning, somehow after you got finished singing, it was a different day, and you had a different outlook on what was going on.
June told me that she helped make this Red Devil outfit for him. Suction cup horns, the works, everything.
It was in Rotary Club, and he was going to give a speech, and he had decided he was going to be the devil's advocate, so he was going to dress up like the devil. So he did. And so that day he went into the men's restroom, and he was all ready to speak, and this man came in, looked at him, and said, "Well, I always knew I'd meet you, but I didn't know it'd be today."
Always keeping you on your toes, always keeping you laughing.
A famous costume of his was the Spaceman, which he created for a speech at a Farm Bureau convention.
He got a helmet, kind of like a football helmet, that he made up more like a space helmet. He got a watch that he pretended he could talk from space to Earth and things of this nature. And then he gave a speech about Farm Bureau and various things, but as though he were in space.
He was never sufficient with where he was and what he was. And I guess he would be disappointed if you ever were, and was always sort of pushing. Just push yourself that little bit, that little bit.
He'd encourage you to learn more, study more, better yourself. I would volunteer time with Arizona Department of Corrections Juvenile. So on Saturdays, when I would need to go in, Marvin would say, "Yeah, go ahead, I'll cover for you." Now, how many bosses, owners of the company would do that?
Whatever we will ask him, he will do for us.
The Farm Bureau experience became another large part of Marvin Morrison's life. He was very involved and successfully served as president.
Farm Bureau is like a chamber of commerce is to urban businesses, and their only goal is to make agriculture better for the world.
I know he was a strong supporter of the Farm Bureau, and I think that's probably why the Farm Bureau headquarters sits on his old feedlot property.
I consider him a mentor in my early years with the Farm Bureau. You can imagine that Marvin Morrison knew a lot about Maricopa County agriculture and about the state's agriculture because of his role.
Dad wanted agriculture to have good PR. And so Farm Bureau employed people who were very effective with public relations and who told agriculture story well.
And these farmers, including the Morrison family, they're large, they're sophisticated, they're college educated.
Even after he was no longer president of Farm Bureau, he was still very much in demand to be a speaker, and he continued to go to the state conventions.
Farm Bureau does have distinguished service to agriculture, and that was given to Marvin not too long after he was president. And that's our highest award. It's distinguished service to agriculture. It's presented by the board of directors, usually to some long-time service, not only to agriculture, but to the Farm Bureau.
Not many people knew that when John F. Kennedy was president, Marvin was actually approached about joining his cabinet as Undersecretary of Agriculture.
Marvin is a registered Republican. John F. Kennedy, obviously a Democrat. But from what he had heard about Marvin, he wanted him in his cabinet.
That may have been one of the reasons they wanted him, is because if he could be on their page and still be a Republican, that might have been to their advantage. I think he didn't want to be in that kind of atmosphere. He didn't want to be where he had to change his moral compass to suit somebody else's.
By all accounts, Marvin had the charisma to be a politician, even though he chose not to. People certainly respected and followed him.
I think to be charismatic, you have to have more than just that first blush.
Everyone respected him because his track record, they knew his moral values, they knew that if he got behind a project, it was the project to get behind.
He was a very cohesive personality that brought things together.
He
led by example and by enthusiasm, and people wanted to be where he was. So whether it was Boy Scouts or FFA or Farm Bureau or any of the other things that he did in those years, he just swept people up in his wake.
I think he was a leader, and you didn't even know you were being led.
You didn't realize that he was leading you so much. He pretty much convinced you that it was your idea at the end.
He's able to bring people together, and I think that's a very great quality of Marvin and my dad.
In the Farm Bureau, I mean, he brought over 4,000 farmers together. I mean, farmers are very independent, but they got to come together on some common problems, such as the interface between rural and urban peoples. He painted the picture, and people were able to color it in. It was marvelous.
I think his involvement in the community certainly made it a better community and guided the community to where it is now.
Some people have referred to him as a community builder. Now, as a kid, I never viewed him that way, his dad. But looking back at it and seeing everything that he was involved in, it was really easy to see why people viewed him that way.
The younger people in the family wouldn't have seen quite how difficult it was for him to balance the civic life and the leadership in Farm Bureau with farm production.
I couldn't even keep up calling the people rather than going to the appointments.
So he was gone a lot. I stayed with the voice.
Dad spent a lot of time involved with these other things for the greater community good, and we had less time with him than we otherwise would.
Marvin was very active in the community, and again, it just, your family backs you, but they also, in a sense, help pay for your service because they're doing without you, and that can be tough on families.
We mattered to him, but so did a lot of other things.
I think that Marvin would say family was probably the #1 thing to him. It's true, he was involved in a lot of organizations and on a lot of boards, but family really was the key. And
Marvin had a way of bringing out other people's strengths.
He got people to do things that were just sort of not usual for them.
Actually, after Marvin stepped down from chairing the administrative board, he made sure that I took it over. And so then I chaired the administrative board for about another 10 years.
When he decided to get off, suddenly my name would pop up. Well, here's a candidate to fill my spot. And pretty soon I was following along in his footsteps, filling all these spots.
He just put that little pebble out there, and it just grows with people. They're contacted by him, so it's kind of neat.
all 3 of the boys have a great sense of responsibility to the community. They've been blessed greatly, and they know it, and they don't take it lightly, and they want to give. They want to give back to the community in the same way that Marvin did.
I think it's inspired us all to become a bigger part of the community, to contribute what we can, and to carry on the legacy that Uncle Marvin has left us.
What my grandpa really, I think, drove home the best was, you know, even though we've been so successful, we've had so much, I just want to give back to the community.
It seems now if each of us could do one thing to improve someone else's life, what a wonderful world this would be.
It is the case that Marvin and the rest of his children, his grandchildren, really do demonstrate the values that he seemed to have, offered them, and they took him up on it. And the world, and especially Arizona, is a better place as a result.
I think he would be most interested in how did you take your gifts and use them for good, and then use them for better? How did you make your life and the lives of others better? I think would be the question that he would be most interested in.
And that's probably why June latched on to him. He was going somewhere, and it was going to be a fun ride.
A ride that turned to tragedy was the accident. Marvin was taking a large, heavy piece of radio equipment to be repaired when he was hit by a garbage truck at the intersection of Val Vista and Elliott Roads.
It was December 22nd, 1967.
I was just learning to fly in December of '67, and I was on my first solo flight at Deer Valley Airport when the accident occurred. After I landed, there was a call from Reggie Beebe, one of our cousins, telling me that I needed to go to Mesa Southside Hospital as soon as possible. That Dad had been in a serious accident.
Marvin didn't have a stop sign, and the other guy did, but the other guy didn't stop, and he hit him. So it was at a T-bone intersection. Marvin was probably looking at the crops, and it was pretty bad. Kenny thought he was dead.
One of the first people on the scenes were the Aramusbys. They lived within a half a mile of where the accident took place.
I didn't know it was Marvin until Kenny and Reggie Beebe drove up. And Kenny went out there and he said, "Oh God, it's Marvin." I'll never forget, Marvin had rubber irrigation boots on. And when Kenny recognized him.
He rolled that thing several times, and that radio was loose in there with him in the cab.
We almost lost him twice. He was in a coma for 2 weeks.
But it was almost a crisis for the community, and lots of people came. They wanted daily reports on how Dad was doing.
This is a very special necklace to me. It has very, very much meaning, and it's one of my most frequently worn pieces because Marvin gave it to me, and because that was one of the first things he recognized and spoke about after his coma. And his words were, "I always liked that."
When he recovered consciousness, he recognized all of us, which was a great sign.
One of the things that Dad would say, whenever he would go to a hospital or whenever he would go to where he was going to need some nursing care or something, he would say, "I'm going to be your very best patient."
Within a year and a half, I would say, he was not the same, but improving all the time, because it was his general nature to be a risk taker. And so, being a risk taker, he would try challenges that other people wouldn't.
Dad went from being very good at math before the accident to not being very good at math at all after the accident. He went from being decisive to not being very decisive at all. There were a series of changes.
There was a time, according to Richard, that he couldn't count cows as they went through the chute.
And as the animals came on the scale and went off the scale, Dad would count them one by one as they went by, trying to see if he could keep track of how many had passed.
You would be driving down the road and he'd be counting trees or cows or airplanes in the sky and so forth. And he just had the determination to get that ability back by learning it.
I don't remember ever seeing my father angry with another human being, ever. But I did see him angry. One day at the shop, he was over trying to solve some problem, and he was unable to do it. And he picked up a wrench and threw it into the engine block of the tractor. I mean, it was nothing but destructive, and there was no real point in doing it, except that he had gotten to the point where he had to release his anger in some way. So it was a very difficult recovery for him.
He was mad at circumstances where he had the ability to do it before and he couldn't now.
Dad had been the equivalent of 4 average men before the accident, and he was only the equivalent of 2 average men afterwards. And so it was hard for people who didn't know him before to see the difference.
When I met him, he was still so darn sharp, I couldn't see any fall off. So I didn't, maybe June did, but I didn't see any fall off at all.
I think that after his accident, he was not the man she married, but she adjusted to this new personality.
Now, post-accident, I'm in my teens, and he's not as decisive as he was before, but he's much more available. I have a sailboat that's 12 feet long and made out of styrofoam. I think I may have got that sailboat before the accident. And I just finished rehabbing that with a new sail and whatnot last year. And I did that because my dad and I put fiberglass on the outside of that together. And that makes that very precious to me.
And I remember before the accident, his sending me long letters when I was away on national FFA business, in which he seemed to be having fun with the idea that he would write sentences filled with words that I probably wouldn't know. And he would force me to go look them up. After the accident, it took some time before he could get back to that level. And I think it was a source of immense pride for him, as well as for me, particularly when he went back to school, and did quite well.
Probably he should not have survived. Probably nobody else would have.
Even after the accident, he did so many things. It's amazing.
If he had spent all his waking hours grinding his teeth over what he used to be able to do and couldn't, that would have been a very sad existence.
He was still very happy, but he was just a little bit more complacent and just, along for the ride, whereas before that, he was out there and just really driving the bus.
I think I'm the one that can say that his accident did change him initially, and probably some ever after, but not his character. He was always helpful to people. He was always thoughtful of other people. He would do such things as put the mail in the mailbox so it'd be easy for the mailman to get it out of there. I never said anything to him about that. He just did it.
I think he was so profoundly grateful to be alive after almost losing his life twice, first in the war and secondly in the accident, that he had nothing but a grateful heart for the gift of life itself.
The Arizona Dairy came into being when another dairy was closing down. Its manager, Jim Tappan, suggested that he and the Morrison brothers start a dairy together.
To start with, the dairy was in his heart because he said that when they were children, his brother and him, they would go to deliver the milk.
We delivered on bicycles and sold it and delivered it and stood the breakage on the jars for 25 cents a gallon.
The dairy was always something that was in Dad's heart. He loved the dairy.
Marvin used one of his meeting name tags with the shape of Arizona on it as the inspiration for their cow brand and for what became the name of their now famous dairy.
And that's how the dairy was named Arizona, the Arizona Dairy, which I thought was very generic. I thought they should call it Tapmore Dairy because our manager was Tappan and our name was Morrison, and Tapmore milk sounded like a good thing to me.
That dairy was, and it was the talk of not just Arizona, but the talk of the nation. It was the largest dairy, if not the largest, it was one of the top three on paper.
Arizona agriculture has always been a leader of agricultural technology in the country, and Marvin was part of that. Marvin understood new things, innovation.
Morrison Brothers wanted to be a place where producers could learn the latest, greatest production technique. And Dad was very much a part of commitment to that.
They created a methane regenerator to power the dairy, and this was way ahead of its time.
He brought an engineer to work on site and get the methane project going. And I think it took about a year.
But they were very innovative with the dairy, in fact, that they were milking 24 hours a day.
They put fans on for the cows so they could produce more milk.
When we hired this nutritionist with a PhD in animal nutrition, then they put together a very a different diet for the cows, which included a lot of different ingredients. So our milk production went way up.
The fact that they put melted fat in the ration inspired another Marvin innovation, purchasing a railroad tank car to store it in.
They had somebody come out and weld all the little places where it was put together, and seams, all the seams, and then they filled it with hot fat, and what happened was it just oozed out in sprays all over everything. The welders had evidently created holes instead of filled them. And so I said to my husband, well, I suppose you'll put water in there next time before you put hot fat in there.
I suspect part of the reason for his success was he wasn't afraid to try something, but he also, and this is probably a real significant factor, wasn't afraid to admit an idea wasn't working and let's stop doing it rather than just perpetuate it.
They raised their own calves. They didn't buy any animals off, so they didn't bring in diseases.
I think we were one of the first in Arizona, at least, to implement embryo transfer in the 80s. A lot of dairymen would have just like, you know what, I don't think we can do that. Well, they did it.
Anytime that they had tours, he was right there with all this.
He had put in the telephone directory that you could have a tour at the dairy. So we had lots of school children that came for the tours. We had lots of winter visitors that came for the tours.
I went on a tour one time with a group of flying farmers. That's got to be, goodness, 40 years ago. It was right after the dairy got started, so however old the dairy was. And they still ask about that dairy.
I can remember groups coming from Russia to see agriculture in the United States, and they'd come through Arizona, and someone would say, you need to go talk to Marvin Morrison, because he would be an enthusiastic proponent, cheerleader again, for Arizona agriculture and what is done here, and he'd show that dairy off and love it.
He just enjoyed it. He was just interested in what was happening everywhere, whether it was in China or Argentina or wherever. If it affected farm produce, he wanted to know.
Interesting people came from all over the world. And one day, I was in the office, an FBI agent comes in. Then he said, I would like to talk to you. I understand there's a tour group coming from China to tour the dairy. I'd like to talk to you and Marvin and brief you before the tour on what to look for and things like that. I was sort of expecting you guys 2 weeks ago when the Russians were here. And said, the Russians were here?
We took 25 busloads of people out there to see this dairy, and Marvin met every one of those buses and rode around the dairy with those buses.
It was like he was walking through the place for the very first time.
He would encourage the elementary students to come out there by the busload to see where milk came from so that they understood that the green stuff that was growing was getting turned into milk by these cows.
We had gone under other field trips to dairies and other kinds of agricultural activities. We had not received that attention. We had not received that understanding of modern day agriculture, and hosted by someone who has just taken all the time that he needed to answer our questions and tell us things and try to challenge us to accept some new goals in our education and to go on to college and improve ourselves and that kind of thing. So we left there with a desire to be something different than what we had been when we made that first visit.
They arranged for a field trip to go to Arizona Dairy. All the kids were fascinated. The cows are huge, the calves are cute, the feed is, sweet and musty, except for the smell that is pervading everything. And so of all of the children, I was the one to get sick. Yes, Grandpa's girl tosses her cookies in the dairy aisle. It was a proud moment for the Morrisons.
We used to get the dairy reports at the school, and you can always look through there. There's Arizona Dairy on top of the milking list, and not only are they doing things good for the environment, but they're also outproducing everyone else in the state.
And it's just not pure numbers, but that would get people's eyes open. Hey, there's this dairy out in the middle of the desert that's milking close to 10,000 animals. We ought to go out there and take a look at it. But then they also heard, but they're milking out of a polygon parlor. They've got automatic machines that come off, and they don't have to have a milker take the machines off. I would say a typical tour, with a lot of questions, would be a 2 to 3 hour tour. Marvin, do you have time for it? Always, always.
But before that, he had prepared all kinds of soda, all kinds of food. So I was set all that up, and they would come in, and it was like a smorgasbord right after the tour.
It was the spark of his life.
He was proud. He was proud to show it off.
My mother would walk down to the dairy because I had her out at the house at the dairy every day to get her coffee. And Marvin would bring her flowers once a week. She'd always say when she got down there, she says, Elaine doesn't like me in here. I'm bothering everybody. And Marvin would say, no, Alta, just sit down and drink your coffee.
I really see a lot of Marvin and my father, similar types of personalities. And he was so good to me those years after my dad passed away, and those years running the dairy until he passed away, that, he meant a lot.
Marvin and Kenneth kept farming for a long time, 50-some years, I think 53, and way longer than most people would farm. Most people wouldn't have the ability to do that, or the stamina to do that, or the will to do that.
My 2 boys are partners in the same type of farming operation that Dad and Uncle Marvin used to be in. And I just only hope that their partnership is as successful and fulfilling as Dad and Uncle Marvin's was.
I think as we look back upon agriculture in Arizona and the people that have influenced that, as well as influenced their communities, that Marvin would certainly stand tall there.
I think they just were really, will go down, and at least in the history of farming and the dairy industry in Arizona, as, pioneers, no doubt. And Marvin being the leader of the pack.
Another piece of Marvin Morrison's puzzle was his great love for education, which coursed through his veins. He served on the school board for 13 years, and he himself never stopped learning.
I think it was Marion Wright Edelman that said, "Service is the rent we pay for living. It's the very purpose of our lives, and it's not what you do in your spare time."
Marvin's school board service preceded my own, but I would have to say those coattails were fairly lengthy.
His motivation was pure. I live here. This is my community. I need to stand up and take care of the citizens in Gilbert, and he did that.
So education was just in the water assumed to be a high priority.
Well, school was always our priority. There was never ever any question about that.
One of my memories of Dad was that we would be sitting at the dinner table and something would come up, and he would leap from the table and run into the den and get the appropriate volume of the encyclopedia and run back to the kitchen table and read to us about that subject that would just come up.
I think anything we did together had something to do with education, is whether it was with beef or with the church, or if we were going to a play, it was something that would enrich us in some way.
They have books, so constantly they were reading, and Jung loved museums.
He certainly wanted a good educational base for whatever children came through the Gilbert School District.
There's one thing that pulled everything together, and that was a school. And Mr. Morrison was one of those people that made the school the center of the community, and everything expanded from there.
He would get all the new employees of the Gilbert schools on a school bus and give them a tour of Gilbert. He was very proud of this community, and this was his home. He didn't have to move out to move up. And one of our assistant superintendents actually met his wife on the bus.
Not only did he want to educate you, but he wanted to understand where you were coming from. What were your experiences?
He enjoys teaching and explaining things to people, as well as learning new things.
I haven't thought of my grandfather as an educator, but of course he was. He would get down close to something, and he was the only one in my life that would say, "Looky here," but he'd say, "Looky here." And he would take your attention, and maybe it was a leaf, draw it really close, and he would point out all the small details. And by the time he's finished telling the story, you thought it was just a leaf, and it turns out it's a whole new world that you hadn't thought about before.
In 1982, the Morrisons endowed the Morrison Institute for Public Policy at Arizona State University for the purpose of making unbiased data available to the legislature and state decision makers.
The mission is to be timely, to be data-driven, to be neutral. And the motivation was mom and dad and grandma and grandpa looking around and saying, this is not a resource we have in our state right now. We're making some critical decisions, and we're doing it without the benefit of quality research. We want to change that picture. And they did. It's phenomenal.
In the early days of the Institute, we got both sides of the picture. Some people would say that it was too liberal, and some people would say it was too conservative. And then my viewpoint was, if you get it from both sides, it must be pretty good.
He wanted to make sure that people and place were whole. That then extended to the state and the valley through the Institute.
We've been very happy with that particular philanthropy. It lasted all these many years, and I think by now it's getting close to 40.
Working with them made me really proud, because this was a family that just wanted to do good things for the state that had been good to them and where they'd raised their kids. And they never, ever one time interfered with what the Morrison Institute did or the positions it took on public policy.
In 1998, the family made another generous endowment to create the Morrison School of Agribusiness and Resource Management at Arizona State University.
I feel a great sense of pride about how my grandparents and our family gave so much to ASU East, and continuing that education of agriculture it's been astounding.
And I wanted to build it up to be a nationally recognized and maybe leadership kind of school in agribusiness.
This is a guy who really cared. This is a guy who gave a damn. This is a guy who wanted to see things turn out well for people. And it wasn't, he wrote a big check.
Of course, his original college experience was interrupted by World War II.
I got the impression he did not like to leave loose ends anywhere at any time.
I think he had completed that part of his life of growing a large enterprise of all kinds of agricultural kinds of things. But he did it without any credential.
When Marvin decided to go back to school, June was supportive, but wondering, you're already successful. Why do you need to do this?
I always explained it this way, that he went back to school to learn how he did what he did.
Marvin seemed to want to go to school because he just really enjoyed learning, right? And as a faculty member, that's the student you want to have in class.
I've heard some of the professors say that was their favorite student of all time was Marvin Morrison.
He had his own way of doing things. For instance, the young ladies in the department decided they were going to have a spring dance. He asked them, how much do you need? And they said they thought they could put the dance on for about $500. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, gave them 5 $100 bills and said, concentrate on the music, concentrate on the dance, don't worry about baking cakes and washing cars. I thought they would energize him, and no, it was reversed.
One time, one of Marvin's professors maybe got more than he bargained for with some silly animal hats.
I believe Marvin got a chicken hat, not because he was chicken, but because it was sort of the only animal he could find that began with CH that was sort of like a cheerleader, and Marvin was the perpetual cheerleader. Marvin felt that was his mission, so he would go through the rest of his classes with that chicken hat, And
I just remember people telling me, oh, that's the guy who came in the clown suit one day.
He did receive an honorary doctorate, but I think he wanted an earned doctor's degree because everything he'd ever done in his life, he had earned.
The real purpose, the real driving force behind the honorary doctorate was not the philanthropic part. It was a person who cared about Arizona's future, a person who got in very early and made a commitment to the well-being of people in the Gilbert community, in the valley, and the state.
It wasn't more than maybe a week or two later, he happened to be in the building, and as he was walking down the hallway, and he was walking in my direction, and I said, Dr. Morrison, how are you this morning? And he walked up to me with that grin there, and he said, I'm fine, thank you. And he said, that thing to his lip again, he said, I'm a little, just call me Marvin.
I think that was Marvin. He wanted to earn his way, and he did. Marvin, his personality and his ability to pull people together had a tremendous impact on the growth of this district. And the district doing well brought in people to the town that did well and liked to live here.
It's been interesting, of course, to see the growth all around us. The farms disappear and all of that go away.
It got to where at night, if you were baling hay, they'd complain about the noise. And if you were disking or farming, the dust, the cattle smelled. And then that's what it was. And it's just change of times, progress, that's, I guess.
Well, I think he could see that the valley was growing, and he knew that there would be urban pressures on the farm.
The Farm Bureau had been going through some of its own growing pains. It had moved offices a number of times and was located in downtown Phoenix when they realized that they needed to be in a place that was more rooted in agriculture. A valley-wide search brought them to the Morrison Brothers Ranch at a 5:30 a.m. meeting with Marvin and Kenneth, during which they decided the new building would sit on their old feedlot.
Marvin had a caveat, as of my understanding. He had a caveat that said, I'd like you to leave a legacy of East Maricopa County agriculture.
Farm Bureau building looks at the lake, looks out across all the fields, and up into the mountains where the cattle were. It was a perfect place for us, and it worked out really good. And I expect the Farm Bureau to be there for another 100 years.
We were thinking about the fact that the farm was not going to be a farm the land that we owned was not going to be a farm for very long because of all the growing up around us and all the neighborhoods that were being built and so forth.
He did not assume that we would always be farmers, but he knew, of course, that the day would come when ownership and or management of the farm would pass to the next generation.
I think Marvin wanted them to be what they wanted to be.
It was, the world is your oyster and go and make what you will of it, and I'm going to be right there to be, a journey mate and a cheerleader for you.
Having to give up the farming, seeing the fields go into houses and that sort of thing, I think that was a bit difficult for him.
It's kind of a change in paradigm with the thought process between farming. Now we're going to become land developers, but let's do so responsibly.
And so they controlled it themselves. They didn't sell it off to developers that then put their own spin on what should be there. I think they've done it very well.
And I think because we went slow enough, Dad was accepting and Uncle Kenny was accepting of some of the outward edges, some of the out parcels, so to speak, that weren't just really at the core of everything the farm was.
One of the things about a farming community is that you put your houses facing the street, not walls facing the street. So in Morrison Ranch, we have our houses face the street. It gives it a more open feel and it invites neighborliness.
Well, and if you look at it, they're communities that are lasting. And you do see people out walking around relating to each other.
I believe our roots are in people, not places.
When I graduated from college, I had a couple of different opportunities, but everyone kept telling me, you'd be a fool not to go to Gilbert. It's a beautiful community, beautiful support, and a good working place to be. So I went to Gilbert.
And even though it's grown so much, it's still one of the nicest places to live.
I think he wanted to maintain the flavor of the old community as much as we could, and I think we've done a pretty good job.
I think that once he saw the end result and how Morrison Ranch is designed to honor him and Kenneth and the family, it's based on remembering the agricultural heritage. So I do think he was proud of it when he saw it. And, though agriculture will always be in the Morrison blood, I think he was very proud of what he saw before he passed away.
But Marvin could look down. I think he's very pleased with how things worked out and how his family has continued to help this community grow. I mean, he said he had the blueprint, and I think they followed it pretty well.
Change was happening around us every minute in Gilbert as it grew over the 30 years that I've been here. But I think what I look forward to the most was coming to church every Sunday and being able to see Marvin and June singing in the choir and know that there was at least some things that were going to be stable and that were going to be there and that you could rely on no matter what other chaos was happening around you.
It's a very religious community. People go to church more often than any other community except Sun City.
Church life and school were the centers of social activity in Gilbert for a long time.
I think he was very active in the interfaith movement in the town between all of the churches, not just the United Methodist Church.
Very respectful of religion and other people's religions.
I think that's one of the things that was really special about Marvin. He wasn't closed-minded. He was very open-minded and open to other ideas and other beliefs. He may not have agreed, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't open to them.
He never tried to convert anybody. He never tried to put us on the right path, He just lived the life to exemplify which way to live your life.
And June was a Baptist, but Marvin was a Methodist, and so she was there and supported the church all these years.
I felt sure that whatever we did, we should do together. So I decided that I would become a Methodist.
I told you that education was just in the water. Involvement with church and faith was just in the water.
There was never a time when Dad and Mom were not actively involved in church.
I think that was instilled in my dad through his mom, my Grandma Letha, that they were going to be a church family.
Our children tried everything. I don't like my Sunday school teacher. I don't want to go today. Whatever. But they knew from pretty early on that Sunday was for church.
We would line up literally on a line in the kitchen, and this would be after breakfast, and he would say, on the mark, get set, go! And we'd all run to our bedrooms and get dressed for church, and the first one back to the kitchen wins. Well, it was probably 12 years later before I realized this is their way of getting us ready for church, and Dad would go running through the kitchen, through the house, to his bedroom. This is no fair. I've got to shave.
Uncle Marvin taught Sunday school, sang in the church choir, sat on the church board, was the head of the men's Bible study. His list of duties just went on and on there at the Gilbert United Methodist Church.
Marvin did everything, every job in this church that there ever was almost.
Grandpa, if you couldn't find him at home or the dairy, he was likely at the church.
My brothers and I were often the ones who mowed the lawn at the church, and we just learned that this is a part serving. It's not the pastor's job, it's all of our job to be involved in that. So we just grew up active.
I don't know that there was any time when we didn't lean upon faith and hope. But Marvin was always one to make it fun. That was one of the reasons he did some of the magic tricks in church and so forth. for the children.
I'm sure I remember him playing Santa Claus more than once for the kids.
He and Grandma enabled so many foundational things to happen at the church.
Quietly, somehow, all of this was promised. All of the land was promised.
I felt when it became time for us to sell this property, I promised God that I would do that, and so we did.
If they didn't have enough money to make it to the year, it showed up in the treasury, which most of us knew where it came from, and they just kept that church together.
As he was a role model for me in business, he was a role model for me in terms of a church life as well. But he went on to say, you know, as important as the church is to me, business is too, because there's going to be a lot of opportunity in your life for charity, but you have to earn the money before you can give it away.
Music is a moral law. It gives soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and charm and gaiety to life and to everything. Plato.
My dad was a farmer, but he was much more than a farmer. He was a musician, and he loved music, loved to sing, loved to play.
I play violin. I was a serious student of violin in high school days and in college. At one time I was playing for square dances 5 nights a week.
He wasn't only interested in music, but he was interested in nearly everything, and it just shows what a well-rounded person he was.
That's one of the reasons I like to sit next to Marvin, because Marvin always had the right note. It didn't matter what it was, he was on the right note. So
it was a very common occurrence to be driving down the road and Dad would burst out in song.
He always would keep a harmonica in his drawer, and he'd play it almost every day.
Sometimes all of a sudden I'd hear a violin playing, or I'd hear a guitar playing.
He'd be outside singing, and I'm assuming that the cows are listening too.
One of the things I enjoyed doing with Dad is singing with him. So there were a few times where we would sing a quartet and be the three boys and Dad.
We sang hymns, and we sang 4-part harmony hymns because we were a musical family. It's important to me that you understand that was a foundation that has carried me in life.
A lot of times that I went over, it was either to bake cookies or play with music.
We always have had music, you know, during the family events and stuff, and we'd sing together, and, you know, my grandma would play piano.
Frequently we would get around the piano and sing after dinner.
It seemed kind of like a Leave It to Beaver crew, because when I would show up at the house, June would play the organ and we'd all stand around and sing, which was really neat.
I married into this family that one of the first things I saw was I walked into their house and they had a music room with a grand piano and, you know, guitars and violins and trumpets. And so they said, let's all sit around the piano and have a sing-along. And I'm thinking, really? I have to sing? I only thought this happened in TV shows.
I think the musical gene that I have is definitely coming from Marvin and my grandma and the whole family. And we always have this song that we sing when we come together that's, you know, basically a toast right before.
It's for health and strength and daily bread we give you thanks, O Lord. And so it's always in 3 parts, and then a very harmonious amen at the end, which is about the most beautiful part.
Uncle Marvin was an inspiration in music. In fact, I was so inspired that I took up the accordion. I was never really very good at it, but Uncle Marvin always encouraged me to keep at it, and I did for years. I still have my accordion.
Listening to the boys serenade their parents during the 50th anniversary made me think they must have done something very right to have earned and deserved this kind of affection. I'd never seen anything like that. It was very deeply moving to recognize that here, amidst I'm at the Institute, I'm studying the breakdown of society in some ways, families falling apart. Now here, on the other end of the continuum, was this family that had these great values where the kids loved their parents. And it wasn't just, let's go up and sing because we've got to sing. There was a genuineness to this that is absolutely stunning. And it really stuck with me.
There's joy in music, for sure.
My doctor cousin says that that's the last thing we lose. Music is the last thing we lose.
Music wasn't very far away from Dad.
I suppose the sort of penultimate story that proves the importance of music in his life and also the importance of religion in his life is that on the last day of his life, the nurses reported to us that he was playing his harmonica and he was playing the hymn, Standing on the Promises of God. He died that night. I believe all the saints have been in awe as witnesses to your journey here, and that all the company of heaven has rejoiced to welcome you home to new life.
When Marvin passed, it was a very challenging time for everyone. He's one of those cornerstones, one of those rocks, and you just never think of him not being around. But then, much as we've talked, he's still here. Physically, miss him, miss the smile, miss the little dance that he did where he clicked his heels together on occasion.
Just click his heels
Out
together.
of joy, sometimes we saw him jumping in the air and click his
He
heels.
was famous for clicking his heels, and he did that, I think, with great joy.
Especially in his 80s. He always made a point of kicking up his heels.
At this meeting I went to at his church, and he's old by now, and Richard was there, and Richard was trying to kind of hold him, but he was full of energy, but we came walking the door, and he jumped up and he clicked his heels.
And he'd kick both of his legs up to both sides and kick his heels together, and off he'd go. And that wasn't show. That was how he felt.
He'd just kick up his heels and click them together, and I swear that the day Marvin walked into heaven, God got a dose of it.
Everyone who knew Marvin, even fairly well, would always talk about his congenial, upbeat personality, his smile, and his firm handshake.
He could make friends right away.
He always had the same greeting. He would open the door to be, "Hello, everybody!" And it didn't matter if you were 1 or 20 people. It would always be that greeting. And he was always delighted to see you there.
He always felt like he had just been waiting for you to show up. And then you show up and he was happy. It's like, oh, been waiting to see you.
And he is interested in people, so look out. He wants to get to know you.
Marvin Morrison will brighten your day like a sunshine.
I can probably count on both hands the number of times I've seen him really, really down. And we were married 62 and a half years.
I think the man's pants could be on fire and he'd find a way to be positive about it.
Something would happen like the tank that the hot fat was in and it all went down out the holes. He would say, "That's life."
And even later in life, he still had that puckish grin and that enthusiasm.
I marvel at the fact that I cannot remember a single incident in which my father was angry at another human being.
He just never talked bad about anything, particularly. He's just positive.
He would get firm sometimes, but he never lost his cool, ever, I saw.
I don't think I ever saw mad. Maybe just a little bit mad one time. I don't even remember what it was. It wouldn't have been much.
I don't remember Dad ever raising his voice to me a single time.
Dad was an encouraging father. I did not get discouragement or disappointment from him. I got a push to be better, but it wasn't from a harsh word.
Marvin was a very humble person. And I think that's probably why people loved him so much.
You would never have known how successful he was in business, not only in Gilbert, but in Arizona and in the nation. I remember his old beater truck that he loved and was his main mode of transportation. Many younger people that would have that affluence wouldn't be driving a truck like that, but that was Marvin's personal touch.
He was such a giving person. That's what I would say about Marvin. He was a giving person. I guess I saw that very early on.
You go to dinner, and he always wanted to pay. And sometimes he would do it secretly, so you couldn't stop him.
He was a good guy. Big heart, huge heart.
My mother passed away shortly before Scott and I got married, and my sister, who is 12 years younger than me, moved in with us. So she was not his, she was not his. Wow. But he was really generous to her.
And years later, when I took him in to have some blood work done, and then he came out and I went in to have my blood work done, the lady said to me, "You have a real good man there." I said, "How do you know? He's only been in here a minute." "Oh," she said, "you can tell." So I could tell.
And June, too. There's no Marvin without a June.
He was so busy that I know the boys have a lot of his traits, but I think that June contributed an awful lot to the way the boys turned out, and they are very good to her today.
Marvin was very devoted to June.
She's been basically blind since she was 75, and she doesn't let that stop her.
If I wanted to try some new treatment or do something that for my eyes, he was all for it. Well, the way he took care of me was by being optimistic and upbeat about nearly everything we tried to do.
I don't think he ever stopped trying to prove that he was good enough to marry a Neely.
I'm here today because Marvin and June are the epitome of community builders. They are what every human being should aspire to be.
Marvin meant a lot to me. There were times I think he treated me like a son.
Well, Marvin Morrison was somebody you wanted around. If there was more of them like him, this world would be a better place.
It was an honor and privilege to know him and his family.
We do need more Marvin Morrisons in this world. He's kind of a dying breed, I'm afraid.
If all men were, and ever would be, like Marvin Morrison, we wouldn't have the troubles we have. We'd take care of our families, we'd take care of our kids, we'd look out for each other.
I think he lived bigger than life. He dreamed big dreams, he made big things, he made impact, he lifted people in the speeches up to bigger and better things, he inspired people, he lived it.
I thought about Marvin the other day. The poem by Walt Whitman, where at the end where he says, "The powerful play goes on, and you can contribute a verse." Well, his verse was a little bigger than most of ours, but nonetheless, he encouraged you to contribute your verse.
We have a great-grandson born just Labor Day this year, and his middle name is Marvin, and his last name is Morrison. One of the most comforting things I've done in a long time was to hold that baby for a couple of hours. It's very, very, very calming and inspiring sort of insight on life, because here's a new life, a perfect little baby. This Malachi, his name's Malachi. And what's he going to be like? I hope he's like his great-grandfather.
everybody has the potential to go in life far beyond what they're doing or what they think they might do.